hello everybody, and welcome to this session on truth-telling that's been brought to you by Amnesty International and Essential Media. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging country, and I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to ask you to join me in acknowledging the nation on which you're currently watching this event, and in your own way pay respects to elders past and present. Just a couple of housekeeping things in this new way of doing events and conferences. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded later online, but it's live streaming now, so please be respectful and not say anything that you wouldn't in public. For those of you who haven't been to one of these events, they're designed to be relaxed. Encourage you to keep your video on. It actually is a bit easier for the speakers, and it helps create a better feeling when we can't be in the same room together. So if you view on gallery and then keep your video on, that will be great. There is a chat function, so please ask any questions there, make comments, introduce yourself. Feel free to engage with other people in that way. Everyone will be on mute, and only one of the administrators can unmute you. So if you're called on during the Q&A, you'll be asked to unmute your, to press a thing that will come up to tell you that you're happy to unmute. And we're encouraging people to use full names, organisations if you want, and hopefully you know how to rename yourself on the file by clicking the three dots up in the corner of your image. And if you are having any technical issues, just private message the tech support team. So I'll also give you the caveat that I'm not great with technology, so I'm going to try and wing my way through this. But to take us through this interesting and very important and timely topic, we have three great speakers: Lidia Thorpe, Rodney Dillon and Bruce Pascoe. I think bringing such a fabulous group of speakers together couldn't be more timely. We've seen over the past few weeks how ancient rock art isn't protected, but statues are somehow seen as critical to national conversations. We've had a Prime Minister who said there's no slavery in Australia, and then when challenged on that, had the excuse that it wasn't learnt at school. We still continue to see issues such as the impact of child removal and massacres on the frontier remind us that First Nations history and lived experience is often politicised, with the impact of that being that those voices are silenced or not heard. So it's little wonder in that context that the concept of truth-telling remains on the agenda. So our first speaker, who I'd like to introduce you to in a little bit more detail, is Lidia Thorpe. She's a Gunnai-Kurnai and Gunditjmara woman, and as many of you would know, is the very newly minted senator-elect for the Greens. So watch out, Canberra. I really admire Lidia. She is an unflinching voice on Indigenous issues, especially contentious issues. She always speaks to truth and from the heart, but with that passion also comes great intellect. So I think we're incredibly lucky to have Senator-elect Lidia Thorpe. I just love that, Senator Lidia Thorpe. Here. Lidia, I thought maybe we could just start by getting you to tell us whose country you're on today.
Sure, thank you, Larissa. I am sitting on stolen land, the land of the Wurundjeri people. So I'd like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people and those of the Kulin Nation, which are the surrounding clans and nations. And I'm a Gunnai-Kurnai Gunditjmara woman. Thank you.
I was wondering, obviously one of the things that you have really consistently raised is the importance of a treaty. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit from your perspective about why a treaty is a really big part of the truth-telling process.
Yeah, well, you know, since I was a kid, I've had my family around me talking about a treaty. So it's, you know, whilst it might be a buzzword right now, it's something that I've been a part of all my life. I think that for us to mature as a nation, we need to first go through a truth-telling process. And then at the end of that, we need to have a conversation about how we're going to go forward as a nation. I think a treaty gives us the mechanism to do that. We are the only Commonwealth country in the world that doesn't have a treaty with its First People. And so I think a treaty can address the continued injustice against this country's First People and this country's environment and climate. I think a treaty is not a, you know, a First Nations thing or an Indigenous thing or a blackfella thing. A treaty is for everybody. And, you know, I encourage you all to think about what you'd like to see in a treaty, because if you don't start speaking up about what you'd like to see, then the government will decide for you. And that's, you know, we're seeing some of that kind of happening at the moment. And I think that if we want to have a true process of a treaty, which is about an end to a war, which, you know, many of Aboriginal people in this country still say, including my family, there's still this war going on against our people here. And that war needs to end. And I think a treaty will be a mechanism to end this injustice, and also give us an opportunity to celebrate and have an identity as a nation. You know, we also need to think, what is our identity as a nation? Is it throwing a shrimp on the barbie and having a beer? Or is it about the oldest continued living culture on earth? I know which one I'd choose.
And Lidia, just to dig into that a little bit more, what do you envisage a treaty will mean in practical terms for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? And I'm also interested in this, and obviously you've been leading these debates, so I'm just also wondering what people are saying to you when you do ask them that question about what do you think a treaty should mean and what should it mean to you?
Yeah, well, look, not all Aboriginal people are going to agree with a treaty either. So I believe that we need to have a comprehensive consultation that we saw, you know, 20 years ago with the reconciliation process. Aboriginal people around the country were consulted as part of that process, and so were non-Aboriginal people. And so we need to do that again, but we need to talk about treaty and what people want to see in a treaty. And also that's going to be different for different mobs. So, you know, we have people we have blackfellas in the city and people in remote communities. We have different needs, and there are different kinds of injustice and policies that are set up to, you know, continue the injustice, if you like. We still have the high rates of removal of children, incarceration rates, deaths in custody, the destruction of our environment and our water. So I think if we, you know, have those conversations, and people will decide themselves, which is about self-determination. And self-determination is one of the articles in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, the UN Declaration. So I think anything that ensures that we're in line with that declaration for the Indigenous rights from the UN, then, you know, we can't go too wrong. But we have to have a process that is respectful and that actually talks to the grassroots people who are experiencing this injustice, and not, you know, some hand-picked leaders who think everything's okay.
So Lidia, obviously there'll be a lot of focus on your agenda when you're in the National Parliament, when you are working there from Canberra. I was wondering how much the treaty is on your agenda, and I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on the extent to which a treaty would be a national project, or, you know, you do talk a lot about needing to recognise that different groups will have a different agenda, and how might that work in terms of how a treaty process might structure to accommodate that?
Look, I haven't had a chance to meet with my colleagues in the party room yet, or even be sworn in. So I've got to first have, you know, the Victorian Parliament actually adjudicate my senatorship. So once we get through those processes, I will be having this conversation, because I think this is what this country needs. We are so divided as a country, and we saw that through the Black Lives Matter rallies. I see it every day in my community, and I think that we need something that's going to unify us and bring us onto the one page that will sustain our futures and your futures in a way that, you know, we collectively have to look after one another. We've seen that through COVID, you know, people reaching out and making sure people are okay. Well, that's what we should be doing as a society. And looking after our environment together. That's, you know, that's what we've been doing for thousands and thousands of generations. It's our responsibility, and we want you to take some of that responsibility and understanding of why we need to protect this country and everything that belongs to it. So I think that treaty isn't a hard thing to do. It's going to be a beautiful conversation. It's going to be a hard conversation, but it's one we need to have to be able to mature as a nation.
I was actually going to ask you about what you thought the appetite is for a treaty among the general population and the general public, especially, as you say, at a time like this where, you know, it does feel like things are very divided, and just wondering what your thoughts are on that. And obviously, hearing you speak, you seem quite hopeful about the fact that this could be a way forward.
Yeah, look, I think the more people understand treaty and that it's a blank canvas. We can talk about all the treaties that have been problems or problematic in other parts of the world, and yes, they have. Treaties can be broken, promises can be broken, but let's learn from that. Let's get in contact with our brothers and sisters around the world who know the good, bad and ugly of their treaties, and let's make ours the best one there's ever, you know, that they've ever seen, given we're the last country to have the conversation. I think we can come up with something beautiful that will unite us. And when I go and talk to non-Aboriginal audiences and I put it back on them and say, what do you want to see in a treaty? It works out to be exactly what I want to see in a treaty. So I think the more we have those conversations, we'll realise how much we actually have in common as a people.
Great, thank you, Lidia. I'm going to now turn to our next speaker, Rodney Dillon. Rodney Dillon is a Palawa man and Amnesty International Australia's Indigenous Rights Adviser. I've had the pleasure of knowing Rodney for many years, since we were very young, and since he was a ATSIC commissioner, and at that time was a staunch advocate for Indigenous rights, particularly around heritage and hunting and fishing, which is something that's very close to his heart. And so always been a leader who's shown enormous wisdom in how he conducts himself. And I have to say, as the generation who's followed him, I've felt particularly lucky to have had him as a bit of a mentor. So Rodney, it's great to see you. And whose country are you on?
I'm on my own country, Palawa country, here in Tasmania today, yes.
And I guess I thought I'd start by asking you, Kevin Rudd's apology in 2008, a really important historical moment, and seemed to be the beginning of a different conversation coming out of the Howard era. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on how far we've progressed and why we may not have progressed further along the road to reconciliation, in your opinion.
Yeah, thanks. I think that when Kevin Rudd, I was there in Canberra that day when he made that apology, and to see them old people crying who's finally accepted for what had happened to them. And it was a really significant moment in our history as a country. But unfortunately, we haven't had any leaders since then that could conjure up that way to do that, to go forward. And I think it's left us in a vacuum. I think that we've gone, and when leaders don't stand up, the things that people do go backwards very quickly. So from that apology, you know, we've gone backwards very quickly, I think, in many ways. The racism has got a lot worse in Australia, and you know, that underlying racism that's been allowed. It's been allowed by leaders in every corner. If we have a look at in New South Wales, in Surrey Hills, that 16-year-old boy, when the police kicked the legs out from under him, army style, to a defenceless kid, and then the police commissioner said it was acceptable. The Minister for Police said it was acceptable. So by them leading by example, they keep us into that, they lead us into that where that's acceptable behaviour on our people. So that's one example of that racism that exists today. And when Kevin Rudd had made that apology, I think we as Aboriginal people, we all thought we was going forwards. But unfortunately, I think we've gone backwards a lot since then. And leaders that we've, you know, or people that thought they was leaders, haven't done so well. And if we have a look at the Northern Territory intervention was on before that, but we were still going through that. The basics card, the CDEP, they're all things that, you know, have been pretty harsh on our people and not helped us out of the poverty circle. I think that they're issues that come up, and they're hard things to address our healing when you've got all these things going on around us as Aboriginal people. We talk about Aboriginal people in the prisons being 28% of the population, and we're only a very small percentage of the population in the first place. Our kids are 22 times more likely to be locked up than any other kid. These are all these racist turns that we have in the country that we've got to try and get through. And it's not everyone that does that, but the ones that have got the power to do it still do it to us. And that's the very problem we've got in this country, I think, today. And that's why we haven't gone ahead. And it's been acceptable to do that, and it's continued to be acceptable over a long time. If we go back a bit in our history and we talk about the atrocities when they first came here, to acknowledge that truth of the past, of the atrocities and the massacres, the cultural genocide, the stealing of the land. They stole the land and shot our people here in Tasmania for their land. They're all pretty horrific things. And in truth-telling, we need to tell the truth of our history. We didn't have a settlement. We had an invasion. And for reconciliation to go ahead in this country, I think that the foundation of reconciliation must be telling the truth before any of that can lead to anywhere. I think it's one of the most important pieces of legislation that we need to put in this country today.
And Rodney, I know one of the areas you've done a lot of work in, and particularly during your time with Amnesty, is around Indigenous criminal justice issues. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit to us about Indigenous incarceration rates, and specifically about the imprisonment of children, and what you think we need to know the truth about in relation to that topic.
Look, I think anywhere in Australia, it's not just Indigenous kids, Larissa, but it's all kids under the age of 14. No kid should be in the prison system. We should be smart enough to have diversion systems put in place to divert these under 14 kids out of that system and get them into where they can be better people in our community. It's important, especially for Aboriginal kids, because a lot of our kids get caught up in that system at that age. And I think that it's not just the imprisonment, but in Tennant Creek, we know they've been throwing kids in police cages, and these kids travel in a police cage. No one else in Australia, if you was in Sydney, Larissa, and you picked up 2 kids in the back of a Land Cruiser with a cage on it and no seatbelts and just sat them on a piece of cloth, you'd be arrested, and rightly so. Yet the police in the Northern Territory can get away with carting our kids around in police cages, and that's not good enough. We've got to make change, and we've got to make them government make change in those areas. But having kids locked up in this system, we know that kids under 14, if a kid's locked up under 14, you can guarantee you know where that kid's going to be when he's 20. This is a program how we address kids. They go into the detention centre. It's like an apprenticeship. It's like the quicksand of crime, as we call it. And once they get in it, they never get out of it. When they finish their apprenticeship in the detention centre, they end up in the big house. And we know that that's no place for kids, and we know it's no place for families. It's no place for mums, and it's no place for dads. But we seem to be, like we say, we're 28% of the prison population. And with these kids in this system, we need to be a better country. We're a better country than locking kids up under 14. And I think that we need to work out just different systems. We've got the Attorney General's meeting in on this later in this month, and I'd like everyone to put a signature to the Amnesty website on raising the age and stopping us from locking these kids up.
Rodney, there's a lot of focus on truth telling about, telling the truth about parts of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, the massacres on the frontier, the child removal, that is about highlighting, what Aboriginal people have been through as part of that colonisation process. But I was just wondering, I think the other part of the truth telling is the importance about talking more about the positives of Aboriginal culture. And I mentioned in my introduction of you to everyone that actually you have been somebody who's very actively fought for the rights to hunt and fish and for heritage protection. And I was just wondering if you could share your thoughts about why it's sort of also important for Australians to learn the truth about the positive elements of Aboriginal culture, the things about it that, that you've embraced and you're really proud of and you've wanted to protect.
Look, all our heritage, Larissa, needs protecting all around Australia. And I heard you mention about what the mining company done in the top of Western Australia, the destruction of our culture. We as Aboriginal people was left in charge of that culture. And every time someone destroys that culture, they destroy a part of us. And that's an important piece of a lesson for people to learn, that if you was left in charge of something and someone else comes along and destroys it, and this is not something that's been left just one generation, this has probably been left 500 generations ago for our people to, and it's handed down from one generation to the other. They're really important steps for us to protect our culture, but it should be all of Australia should be wanting to protect this culture because it's the most ancient culture in the world, and these sites are hugely significant to the whole of the world, not just to the mining companies or not just to us or not just to white people either. They're significant to the world. This is a very ancient culture that needs protection, and we need everyone on board because we can't do it by ourselves. And the laws are not strong enough. The heritage laws in this country might be the weakest heritage laws there is around the world to protect our heritage. And at the end of the day, the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs in each state can sign off to destroy our sites. We've got to get this heritage protection up to the stage where it can protect our heritage and make it strong and look after it. The other part of it, the hunting and gathering, we need to understand what's sustainable, and we're not being sustainable in those areas. We have a look at our water systems. Lidia touched on the importance of water. Water's important to everyone and all the animals. It's also important to all the plants. And when those rivers dry up, everyone suffers. So they're all important steps for us to protect, but they're important steps for us to protect as a country and as a nation, not just us as Aboriginal people. And I think that bringing everyone along together to talk about what sustainable is, they're very important steps as a country to bring the wider, we want things that bring us together, not divide us. We know how the 26th of January divides us as a country. We need things put in place that's going to bring us together and protect these together. When we can put our hand out and walk along with other people and protect these sites and protect these rivers, that's when we will be maturing as a country.
I'm now very excited to introduce Uncle Bruce Pascoe. I can't see him on my screen, but I'm assured he's there. Quickly see if I can scan through.
I'm here, Larissa.
Oh, I got it. It's like celebrity squares and I can't find you. Anyway, I can hear you. You're like the voice of God at the moment. I just would like to introduce Uncle Bruce properly. He's of Tasmanian, Bunurong and Yuin descent, and is, of course, best known as the award-winning author of Dark Emu, which, of course, is just one of many things he's written. He's a prolific writer. But more recently, I think, through Dark Emu, has completely changed the conversation about what we know and how we understand Indigenous cultures. Uncle Bruce has been an inspiration. We were very lucky to have had him at UTS, where he's still an adjunct professor, and I'm just delighted that we can share some of his wisdom with everybody this afternoon. Uncle Bruce, maybe we can just start by getting you to tell us whose country you're on at the moment.
I'm on southern Yuin land. The very southern border of Yuin land is the Eualeyai River, and the farm that I'm on flanks the Eualeyai. And we have a number of Yuin people working here today, and we were talking over lunchtime about these issues and how they don't go away easily. They're still happening in this district today.
Uncle Bruce, I might start by getting you to talk to us about one of the myths that your work has kind of busted about hunter-gatherers, and how, I guess, from your perspective, that was a myth that helped to justify colonial dispossession.
Well, the British, wherever they went, like to refer to Indigenous peoples everywhere as savages, as having no spirituality, no economy, and no work ethic. And that then justified taking the land away from those people as a service to them, not as a penalty. And that's still going on today. And I think that while Australians are ignorant of their history, and some remain deliberately ignorant of their history, to the point where, you know, it's common in Australian Parliament for ministers to stand up and talk about the fact that Aboriginal people didn't invent the wheel, and various other crimes we have committed, without really knowing the history, the full sophistication of the Aboriginal economy, the Aboriginal culture, the Aboriginal spirituality. And it's obvious now from research at Warrnambool in Victoria that Aboriginal people have been here on the southern edge of the continent for 120,000 years. It'll probably be older as each couple of years goes by. That time blows out by 10, 20, 30,000 years. It's not terribly important how long Aboriginal people have been here, because you say time. But it is important that Australians acknowledge this history, because it's not so important to know that it's 120,000 years, but it is important to know that it's 120,000 years without reducing the water in the Murray-Darling Basin to a trickle every summer. That's an achievement. That's a scientific and economic achievement. And by deliberately downplaying Aboriginal achievement, it allows Europeans to justify all the crimes they've done against Mother Earth. So I don't think we're really going to advance until Australia admits the full history of the country and the subtlety of that history. it seems amazing that all Dark Emu was a recitation of the public record, and it seemed to come to Australia as a bit of a shock. And it was on the public record. 10,000 history professors had read all the documents, and it had the colonial myopia is so great that we can't even link 3 or 4 images together and come up with a new idea of Aboriginal achievement. I think that's the crime of the country. I do believe things are shifting fairly rapidly, not in Parliament, but amongst the public. You know, it's pretty obvious that there's a change afoot. Those changes and that momentum doesn't last forever. Remember when Australia was going to become a republic and was probably 2 or 3 votes away from becoming a republic, and that was lost. And within days, all that momentum evaporated. I think there's a little bit of momentum for a change in regard to the justice for Aboriginal people, but that can evaporate very quickly because until it's law, it's a sentiment. And you can't rely on sentiment to deliver justice to Aboriginal people, because Aboriginal people are still being pulled up in the street and being questioned rigorously by police just because they're black, not because they are criminals. This is happening today. It happened at this last weekend in this district, and it's palpable. The anger that people feel, but feel reluctant to express, because the penalty for objection is extreme. And when you live in poverty or close to it, every infraction is magnified to your disadvantage. And the ability of police and the courts to penalise Aboriginal people for the sorts of infraction that you end up giving a kid a lolly for is shocking. It is a real indication of racism in the country. I hate to talk about racism in relation to the country that I belong to, but it is a fact. And until we end up admitting that Australia has a problem in this regard, then we won't change. While people still, like John Howard, but not just John Howard, millions of Australians react so negatively to the fact that someone says there may be racism in the country is an indication there's racism in the country.
Uncle Bruce, often when we've gone through processes of some form of truth-telling, and I'm thinking of the Bringing Them Home report, which of course gave very personal accounts of people's experiences through that policy, both as children who were removed, but families who had children taken away. There's often part of the reaction to it is backlash. It's not necessarily that people always take it on board and change, but there is resistance to it. And that takes a big toll on Indigenous people particularly. And I was just wondering, from your perspective, given that truth-telling is such an uncomfortable and painful process, why from your perspective do you think it's so important that we go through it?
There's a real vested interest in Australia in maintaining the status quo of colonial Australia. And when there's any threat to that status quo, the backlash is severe. And so the leaders of that movement will be targeted by the far right, and the far right are closely aligned to big capital in Australia. This is not an argument against capitalism or for communism. It's they're talking about the alignment of power. And in Australia, the far right is aligned with big money. miners and the extreme end of financial capitalism. And those people have a vested interest in making sure that Aboriginal people don't get a voice, because that voice might ask for a treaty, as Lidia was talking about before, or might ask for reparation, or might ask for land. And there's a vested interest in really conservative forces in this country in cutting down anybody who objects. So the Australian liberal community has to make sure that those people are protected and they are joined by armies of people who assert the same rights. And in that way, numbers will count. And we need to talk to any fair-minded politician, and they do exist, and get them to stand up in Parliament, stand up and be counted. And in that way, we'll water down this, the nastiness of the extreme right. Now, the extreme left can be very nasty too. As Linda Burney said, we want to get rid of nastiness in Parliament, and we want to promote intelligent debate. Intelligent debate in this country will solve many of our problems. Climate change is being thwarted by unintelligent debate, and Australian racial politics is routinely devalued by unintelligent debate. So injecting reality and intelligence into the debate is the death knell of the conservative. And the troops that can be marshalled by the extremely wealthy in Australia, and this is obviously a generalisation, are well organised, very well organised, and incredibly vindictive. So we need to enlist the support of good-hearted Australians, and there are many of them, and encourage them to recruit their children and their nieces and nephews to the cause of justice. And we don't have to be all gush and no guts, but this is so important for the maturity of the country to learn its real history, but then, having done that, to actually deliver justice. And at the farm here, we're employing 7 or 8 Yuin people at the moment. And Andrew Bolt is employing them all. Andrew Bolt's intervention in the idea of Dark Emu having some relevance to the country doubled the sales. Didn't halve the sales as he'd planned, but doubled the sales because a lot of Australians decided they would buy 10 copies at once. And suddenly there was money around, and that money has been used to employ Yuin people. So we can positively discriminate for Aboriginal people. It is not possible. And this idea of Aboriginal unemployment is a construction of white colonial Australia. And we can deconstruct it and produce a positive result for Aboriginal inclusion. And we're working in the agricultural area at the moment. Rodney works closely with fisheries in Tasmania. These are areas where our people can earn money and still be conducting their cultural authority. And I'm looking forward to the next 2 or 3 years where we can show that Aboriginal people can take part in the economy, a legitimate part in the economy, and can grow their kids up independent of government, so that you don't have to go cap in hand to government all the time for any kind of funding. You make your own, and you make your own way. And total independence from government will be one of the achievements of Aboriginal Australia in the future.
Thank you, Uncle Bruce, and very much appreciate you sharing your insights on that. I'm now going to attempt to do questions through this complex system of trying to sift through them. Now, apparently I can ask people if we've got your question to unmic, but my first question is coming from Jess Strong, who apparently can't take her mute off, so she's asked me to ask the question, and it is asking if anyone can provide a list of things they can do or that people listening can do to help Aboriginal people with their rights. Do petitions work? I feel like our government never listens to us. And I think that's a really great question. What can people who want to do something and want to make a difference actually do to support Aboriginal people in having their rights recognised? So I might just ask you first, Lidia, if you had any thoughts on that, since you know, you've obviously worked with several different strategies to try and make change.
Yes, thank you, Larissa, and thank you for the question. This is a regular question we get. How can we help? What can we do? And so, as a result of that question for most of my life, one of the ideas I had recently was to bring together three areas that worked really well in the 80s. And I brought those three areas together, and one's the Koori Information Centre, which was set up in the early 80s in Gertrude Street, Fitzroy, and it was a non-government organisation that provided information to non-Aboriginal people about us and about our struggle, not just culture, but what it's like for Aboriginal people in this country. The other area was the pay the rent concept, and it was something that the National Aboriginal and Islander Health Organisation set up to provide economic independence for Aboriginal people to self-determine their own destiny. And third thing was around Koori College, another organisation that was around in those days, and that was where Aboriginal people used to go to learn about health, but a political health, not the health that you see today. It was health in a holistic sense in terms of how land and water actually is relevant to our mental health and health today as Aboriginal people. So those three combined ideas from the 80s have now contributed to what we're calling a sovereign hub, and a sovereign hub will be supported by the pay the rent concept, and that sovereign hub is now supported by the Australian Conservation Foundation, who are paying the rent by giving us a space in their building to organise ourselves and activate ourselves and basically self-determine what we need to do as Aboriginal people. So we're building the capacity of Black activists and campaigners to get out there with I see an environmental person on the screen here, Nick from Warburton, help working together to stop logging on our country and working together to have a conversation about the power stations on our country. We've been left out of this conversation for too long. And so we need these sovereign hubs set up right around the country with the pay the rent concept supporting it, so that there are no government funds, that it is totally independent, as Bruce talked about. So look into that, Google pay the rent, you'll see it, you'll see some flack that I've copped over it, but that's something that my old people came up with in the early 80s. And NAHO, the National Aboriginal and Islander Health Organisation, was what came before NACCHO. What you see today is NACCHO. Well, NAHO was the beginning. It's a peak body for Aboriginal health. And that was a holistic approach, the whole person, rather than singling out what our health needs were at the time.
Thank you. Rodney Dillon, what's your advice when people ask you how they can support Aboriginal people in getting their rights? How can people be good, proactive allies?
Yeah, thanks, Larissa. I think that never underestimate getting signatures to send to ministers. I think that while we don't think that that's always works, if you can not only get your signature, but can get 20 other signatures from your family to talk to your family about how important this is, whether it's Raise the Age campaign or kids in police cages or whatever it is, they're really important. And when them signatures are there, those ministers do take notice of them. So I think that's one step. But just go into your local Aboriginal organisation, and if you can help out in those organisations, I think they're important steps as well to build that relationship, to go together. Because like we say, we want to go down a road together. The hands are out to make that connection. And I don't think it'll take a lot to make those connections, because it's not everyone's going to treat us badly. It's only, like Bruce said, it's only the powerful people that will do that. The rest of the people in the country have got a good relationship and a good understanding, and who want to make change. They want the rivers to run. They want the area to be clean and tidy. They don't want these destructions of our places or our sites. So if there's anything or rallies that people can attend, there is power in the foot on the ground. I think that they're all important steps, and they're old steps, but they're tried and true, and I think that they're good steps we can take. And building a relationship, and for people to understand the Aboriginal people in the area where they come from, to get to know the people and talk the stories of what's going on in your area and what's happened in that area, so you can tell your whole family, not just one person.
And Uncle Bruce, there's been such a strong positive reaction to Dark Emu. You must have had a lot of people ask how they can be supportive and what they can do. What's your advice to them?
Well, I think at a political level, politicians do respond to handwritten letters and emails and texts and any kind of communication at all, because if it comes from their electorate, they have to be concerned. And a politician who wants to truly represent that electorate will respond. Not all politicians have their mind cast in steel in favour of a political viewpoint. Many politicians are flexible, and so we should target our local members and try and make change that way. But I think a genuine relationship with the Aboriginal community is very important. And a lot of people, after I have said that, you know, one of the best ways to make change is to make friends with Aboriginal people, many people then say, well, I rang the co-op and they didn't respond. But 3% of the population are answering 97% of Australia's phone calls. And, you know, that's not a relationship. What needs to be done is Australians need to know Aboriginal people. And in that way, then real change can happen. A number of times in this community, it has been found that really important elders in the community are completely unknown to 97% of the community. So how can you make change when Aboriginal people are a theory and not a reality? So I think personal relationships are a very important way of starting. You know, it's not good enough to say that you want to, you know, how do I have a relationship with an Aboriginal person? Well, first you need to identify an Aboriginal person and then conduct the relationship like you would with any other relationship. You know, it is not rocket science. It is about friendship and about understanding. And if there are some awkward moments in the development of that relationship because the two of you have a completely different understanding of Australian history, then that's how relationships improve, by discussing those differences. You know, if in your conversation you bring up the fact that 10-year-old kids are rolling around in the back of cages on police trucks, then as friends, this is a relevant discussion you can have. And 97% of Australians don't want our children rolling around in the back of police trucks. So this is something we can do. Everyone can agree on it, but, you know, 2% of misers in the country, 2% of people who are for cruelty, but 97% of us can change Australia. We just need to actually pick up the pen or touch the keyboard or the screen, and we can change Australia. But throwing up your hands and saying, I haven't met an Aboriginal person, or what can I do? I think we can all find ways of doing things if we really wanted to, not some sanctified way which comes to us, you know, easily via a social message. I think we can fight our way through this intellectually to the source of the problem, and it's not too hard to join forces with Aboriginal people for the sake of those 10-year-old kids in the back of police trucks. This is something the whole country can unite behind, because we don't want our children there. We don't want our grandchildren there. We don't want white kids there. So it is something we can agree on. Start from those principles which look on the surface to be the difficulties. They won't be the difficulty, they'll be the solution. And then we start supporting movements like Black Lives Matter, but we also turn up whenever the local community has a celebration or a demonstration. We turn up, and we turn up to support those people. Sitting back, wringing hands and saying how difficult it is to form that relationship is not good enough for a mature nation. We need to actually work, you know, leave the lounge room and work.
Thank you, Uncle Bruce. I'm going to try and squeeze one more question in using this technology that I'm very new to. So let's see how we go. I think Faker Bahadian has a question. So Faker, if you can, and sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but if you're able to unmute and ask your question to the panel.
Thank you, Linda. It's Faker.
Faker, thank you. I apologise.
That's all right, no problem. I just wanted to say thank you so much to all your speakers, including you. It's just been eye-opening, and it's been very fortifying, for want of a better word. My question is, I just wanted to better understand how the treaty, and this is probably a question to Lidia, how treaty aligns with the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I want to know just how I can address the naysayers and what I can use to just counter that, please.
I thought I'd get this question, so thank you. Look, we have to have a treaty first. I mean, truth-telling is fundamental, then treaty, then constitutional recognition as part of a treaty negotiation. I don't see any sense in any way, shape or form going into the Australian Constitution before we go through a treaty process. Because you're asking us to go into the colonial project's piece of paper, which is the law of the land, which I would say the law of the land is my law, the law, you know, that's been here for thousands of generations. We're being asked to go into a constitution that has been imposed upon us. So why jump into the constitution before we talk about a treaty? So I think the way I'd like to see it is that, yes, the Uluru Statement, but the sequence in which we go through is very, very important. And I would not like to see us to go into the Constitution, whether it be through a voice or through any other means, until we have a treaty, until Aboriginal people across this country are afforded the conversation which they've not been afforded to as yet. And unfortunately, you know, it was an invite only at Uluru meeting, and that's why I did walk out. I believe that it was against our rights, our free, informed, prior consent, because there was no information provided to people, and people had an invite to attend. So there are many hundreds of Aboriginal people that didn't get that invite that are still very upset about that. And so a treaty conversation must ensure all of those people have a say. And if we go into the Constitution, it should be via a treaty negotiation point.
Thank you, Lydia. And I'm mindful of the time. Obviously, in relation to truth telling, there has to be listening. So I just want to give a personal thanks to everybody who's attended the conversation today and taken the time to listen to the very strong and knowledgeable First Nations voices that we've had today. It's obviously a very big part of that process is there's the telling part and there's the listening part, and I just want to say thank you for taking the time to do that. These are very difficult forums to run, so thank you also for being patient with me. I understand my papers were moving and shuffling, so I apologise while I'm still working out how it all works. And the other thing that's quite hard is our fabulous speakers don't get the big round of applause. That would be thunderous if we were all in the same room. So can I ask you all to thank Lidia Thorpe, Rodney Dillon and Bruce Pascoe for all of their wisdom. You can hear me clap and just, yeah. Thank you so much. So just remember, this will be recorded. You can play it back and we'll be running it on Radio National as well. So thank you very much. Thank you again, Lidia Thorpe, Rodney Dillon and Bruce Pascoe.
Thank you.
Thank you.